democracy or dictatorship. The quest for power can sometimes be so intense that it trumps the need for peace and tranquility in a region. So be it Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela or Bashar al-Assad of Syria, the ruler doesn't mind putting their nation in chaos politically, socially, and economically as long as they can stay in power. Welcome to the Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we are talking about the refugee crisis across the globe, the origins of the crises, and the social and economic toll they have led to. According to the United Nations Refugee Agency, 68.5 million people were classified in 2017 as having been forcibly displaced because of conflict and persecution, and this number being the highest since the end of World War II. And out of these, 25.4 million refugees have fled to another country to escape war or persecution in their own country. Now, many would imagine that refugees from these countries are flooding into Europe and the United States at record rates. But in reality, the vast majority of the world's refugees have not gone very far. They're mostly living in neighboring countries. So let's take a closer look at the main conflicts feeding the refugee crisis. Syria. The Syrian civil war started with peaceful protests. Young people took to the streets in Syria's southern city of Daraa in March of 2011, following the social media-fueled Arab Spring that had swept through the Middle East and North Africa. As protests spread through Syria, they were countered by strong government crackdowns and increasing violence from both government forces and the protesters. And by the following year, Syria was embroiled in a civil war, with the Syrian military opposing a growing number of militant groups. So far, about 13.5 million Syrians have been forcibly displaced, which is more than half of the country's population. And out of these, 6.8 million are refugees and asylum seekers who have fled the country. And the rest, 6.7 million people, remain in Syria but are displaced from their homes. That means they are internally displaced. So why are Syrians leaving their homes? Violence and a collapsed infrastructure. Since the Syrian civil war, over 600,000 people have been killed, and that includes about 25,000 children. And the war has become deadlier since foreign powers have also joined the conflict. And when it comes to infrastructure, only 53% of hospitals and 51% of the healthcare facilities are functional. And more than 8 million people lack access to safe drinking water. About 2.4 million children are now out of school, and more than 80% of the population lives in poverty. So where are the Syrian refugees going? About 5.6 million have fled by land and sea across borders to neighboring countries, but they mostly remain in the Middle East. And the bulk, 3.7 million, are in Turkey, followed by 855,000 in Lebanon, 670,000 in Jordan, 247,000 in Iraq, and 132,000 in Egypt. In contrast, the US admitted about 18,000 Syrian refugees between October 2011 and December 2016. The biggest problem in Syria has been that within a few years of the conflict, a lot of the international powers joined in. The United States supported some of the rebels, Iran and Russia backed forces loyal to Bashar al-Assad, and as a result, the fighting internally has become deadlier and more intense. So is there a way out? Well, the core issue is around the authoritarian regime in Syria, which has been there since 1971, when the current president Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafiz al-Assad, became president after a coup. He stayed in power for 29 years. And after his death in June 2000, the constitution was amended to lower the minimum age for the president from 40 to 34, which was Bashar al-Assad's age at that time. When a country is treated like a family business, then getting the family out of that business is usually a very violent process. But it can be handled in a more civil way if an opposition forms and it is able to, with the help of the international community, engineer a peaceful transfer of power. But with the current situation in Syria, that seems a little distant. Afghanistan. Afghanistan's protracted war and the Taliban insurgency have made it the second largest source of refugees in the world. The roots actually go back to 1979, when the Soviet Union invaded the country and some Afghan refugees traced their displacement to that time. But the bulk of the current refugee crisis is more recent, and it emanates from the war fought since 2001 by the American-led forces against the Taliban to maintain security and fight the Taliban. And with the United States leaving Afghanistan and the resurgence of Taliban at the same time, the situation has gotten even worse, and that has led to a major refugee crisis in Afghanistan. There are nearly 6 million Afghans who have been forcibly displaced from their homes, and out of these, 3.5 million are displaced within Afghanistan, whereas 2.6 are Afghan refugees living in other countries. Now, contrary to Syria, Afghans have suffered more than 40 years of conflict, and the impact of the conflict on women and girls has been particularly devastating. 80% of the newly displaced Afghans are women and children. And after the Taliban took over Kabul on August 14, 2021, about 123,000 civilians were evacuated by US and coalition forces over a 2-week period. But do note that out of these 123,000, a big chunk of them were US and other foreign nationals. So where are the Afghan refugees headed? A majority of them, approximately 1.5 million, have made it to Pakistan, and followed by Iran, Germany, and Turkey. In August of this year, the United Nations issued a no-return advisory, noting that the conditions in Afghanistan have rendered it no longer suitable for refugees to return. Overall, an estimated 15 to 20% of all Afghans are currently displaced either within their own country or abroad. And as I said before, this is a multi-generational crisis. This is not something that can be resolved in the near future. But even in the long term, is there a path where peace and democracy could prevail in Afghanistan? There is, but a lot of effort will need to be made by international groups and countries to get Afghanistan onto a stable path. That would need to be a two-pronged approach. One is building the infrastructure towards good governance in Afghanistan. And here, the local Afghans have to take on the reins and ensure that they hold their governments accountable. The second, more important aspect is ensuring there is no support, financial or military, provided to insurgents in Afghanistan, notably from the neighbor Pakistan. The United States has tended to lean on Pakistan as a partner in getting Afghanistan on its feet, and that has to stop. There is a lot better awareness now with respect to this role that Pakistan tends to play, but the question is, will the international leadership consider Afghanistan a priority? And based on current science, that unfortunately doesn't seem to be the case. South Sudan. South Sudan was just 2 years old when civil war erupted in 2013. The conflict began as a feud between forces loyal to President Salva Kiir and Vice President Riek Machar. The conflict has engulfed the country in ethnic violence and a devastating humanitarian crisis. Tens of thousands have died in the country, which is the world's youngest and among the least developed. When South Sudan broke away from Sudan in 2011, it was expected that even though South Sudan was primarily more agricultural, it still was oil rich, so there was hope that it will have a stable economy and lasting peace. But 2 years later, fighting broke out between forces loyal to President Salva Kiir and his first vice president, Riek Machar. The fighting has primarily been along ethnic lines, pitting President Kiir from the Dinka group against Vice President Machar from the Nuer group. And both of them have been fighting to control the new country. And this has led to Africa's biggest refugee crisis since the Rwandan genocide of 1994. And the fighting has been going on for access to resources, from oil to grazing land. And this has left 2/3 of the 12 million population in need of humanitarian aid. When the civil war first broke out in 2013, it started with the South Sudan capital Juba, and President Kiir called it a coup attempt on the part of his vice president. And this soon escalated to a full-blown civil war. And by June of 2014, about 1.4 million people had fled their homes. 4 million people, about 1/3 of the population, were facing critical food shortages. And this was partly because the fighting had interrupted farming season, making food scarce and expensive. And as the fighting intensified, by July of 2016, about 2,000 South Sudanese were crossing into the neighboring Uganda daily. And by February of 2017, famine was declared in parts of South Sudan in what the UN called a man-made catastrophe brought on by conflict and economic collapse. By 2019, about 2.2 million had fled to neighboring countries as refugees, and roughly 60% of these were children. At the height of the crisis, close to 72% of South Sudan's children were not in school. And extreme poverty and a history of exposure to the conflict had also made the children vulnerable to recruitment as soldiers to help the armed groups. Yes, children being recruited as soldiers to help the armed groups. The UN's Children's Agency estimated that 19,000 children had served as child armed combatants or support staff in the conflict since 2013. So is there a hope forward? Is there a way out? Well, South Sudan is on a very tricky turf, the ethnic divide. And this divide has existed even before Sudan gained independence from Britain in 1956. Mainly from mutinies in the south, there were 2 civil wars from 1955 to 1972, and then from 1983 to 2005. And this left up to 2 million people dead. And the creation of South Sudan itself was out of a 2005 peace deal to end Africa's longest conflicts between the pro-Arab Muslim north and the predominantly Christian south of Sudan. And in a referendum 6 years later, voters overwhelmingly chose separation, and South Sudan became an independent country. President Barack Obama conveyed a message that read, "A proud flag flies over Juba and the map of the world has been redrawn." Well, protesting is easy. Creating new nations is easy. Maintaining peace is where many of the leaders of these protests and country formations fall flat on their faces. The US was heavily involved in the independence process, but it was a strange alliance between Hollywood celebrities like George Clooney, evangelical Christians, and a bipartisan effort in the Capitol Hill. But what they overlooked were the internal rivalries in the liberation movement itself. There is hope of recovery due to elections being targeted for 2023 as a result of a recent peace deal. But with the intense ethnic rivalries between various groups and the fact that neither the president nor the vice president are willing to yield even an inch, peace already seems to be on shaky ground. Besides the warring ethnic factions, South Sudan's issue is also like Syria's, where the leaders desperately want to cling to power. And that is a recipe for continual repression, strife, and more violence. Myanmar. A flood of Myanmar's Rohingya people poured across the border into Bangladesh at the end of 2017, fleeing persecution by the Myanmar military and security forces. But the Rohingya, a Muslim minority, have faced violence and discrimination in Myanmar, a majority Buddhist nation, for decades. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres describes the Rohingyas as one of the most discriminated people in the world. The Rohingya Muslims represent the largest percentage of Muslims in Myanmar, with the majority living in Rakhine State. The government of Myanmar, though, sees them as illegal immigrants from neighboring Bangladesh and denies the Rohingya citizenship, so much so that the Rohingyas were even excluded from the 2014 census. The Rohingya exodus from Myanmar began in August of 2017 after the Rohingya ARSA militants launched deadly attacks on more than 30 police posts. In response, the troops, backed by local Buddhist mobs, burnt their villages and attacked and killed civilians. Now, this act of burning villages was actually started by the British when they first occupied Myanmar, and I've talked about this in more detail in episode 3. So in the counterattack by the Myanmar troops, at least 6,700 Rohingyas, including 730 children under the age of 5, were killed. A year later, in August of 2018, a report published by UN investigators accused Myanmar's military of carrying out mass killings and rapes with genocidal intent. The issue went all the way up to the International Court of Justice in The Hague, and Myanmar's leader at that time, Aung San Suu Kyi, had to appear before the court in December of 2019. The interesting piece in this entire tragedy is that Myanmar's own Independent Commission of Inquiry admitted that members of the security forces may have carried out war crimes, serious human rights violations, and violations of domestic law, but it claimed that there was no evidence of genocide. The refugees had been fleeing to Bangladesh in the past, but in March of 2019, Bangladesh announced that it would no longer accept Rohingyas fleeing Myanmar. So is there a solution to this refugee problem? There are two factors playing against the Rohingyas. One, Myanmar is a military dictatorship, with a military junta being in charge. And secondly, even in the state of Rakhine, they are a minority, 30% to an approximately 65% majority Buddhist. So even seeking autonomy is out of the question. So the only way this can be resolved is through international pressure. But for some reason, that itself has been missing. And that may be because the world is too shocked and in disbelief that a Nobel laureate heading the government was unable to recognize and put an end to this violence. And on that note, we end this segment of the program. On to the quiz segment. Question from the last episode. Which three countries, despite being major greenhouse gas emitters, have not yet ratified the Paris Climate Accord? The answer is actually none of the given options, because answer B, Iran, Turkey, and Iraq, was the right answer till 2 weeks back, but recently Turkey ratified the Paris Climate Accord. So the answer is partly B, Iran and Iraq. Question for this episode. Which country has hosted the most refugees? Is it A, Colombia, B, Germany, C, Uganda, or D, Turkey? Once again, which country has accepted or hosted the most refugees? A, Colombia, B, Germany, C, Uganda, or D, Turkey? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in this episode. In the next episode, we look at the formation of the world post-World War II, the new world order that took shape, and the factors that contributed to the final world order post-World War II. Till then, stay safe and keep exploring the why in history.